So you came to hear Malcolm Guite tonight, but you're going to have another pleasure of hearing from Brad Davis, another poet as well. And, you know, when you hear the introducer say, this is a man who needs no introduction, that's another way of saying this is a person who's not prepared an introduction. These men need no introduction. But I will tell you this. I got to know both of them before I met them personally in exactly the same way, which is I have a brother who's more well-read than I am, and includes poetry beside. He doesn't read enough biblical studies, but he apparently reads a lot of poetry, and he would send me things from Malcolm Guite. And I said, well, that's pretty darn good. Who is that guy? And then we were sitting up in my cabin, and he's reading me poems from Brad Davis, and I'm like, that's pretty good. Who is that guy? That's literally how I know Malcolm Guite and Brad Davis until we had lunch together on Sunday. And now Malcolm has become a dear friend of Nashotah House. This is his third visit in almost 1 year. And if he shows up on our website on the faculty in the fall, I mean, it's the Lord's doing and marvelous in our eyes. He was our commencement speaker last May. He came back to us to do our Ash Wednesday retreat this spring, and now back for this class. And as we are conceiving of Malcolm's time with us, we thought it would be grand if we also added to that a poetry writing workshop. And the person that Dr. Watkins came up with was Brad Davis. And I said, of course I know Brad Davis. My brother reads a lot of poetry. And so we thought it was a great idea. Listen, you want to hear more from them than you do from me. So without more ado, welcome Malcolm Guite.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes.
That's good. Yeah, so I'm going to share some poems with you. I sometimes, when I've done these evenings, I'll do a little bit of singing as well, just for some light relief and comedy. But I call them songs and sonnets, partly because Songs and Sonnets was the title of the book that John Donne was first published, his poetry in, and I kind of like Donne. Anyway, so I came here to do this, and then I realized we had Brad here. I thought, that's great. And in conversation with Brad, I realized, which I hadn't known until we had the conversation, that we had both written books of poetry in response to the Psalms. We'd found that astonishing book of poetry right at the very heart of Scripture, right in the middle of the Bible, in which, you know, so much of the history and even the prophets gives you the outer life, as it were, the outward and visible life of Israel. But if you want to know what it felt like to go through those, you know, not just life-changing, but history-changing, indeed cosmos-changing events, if you want to know the inside track, it was there in the Book of Psalms. And it still speaks, you know, as Newman said, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaketh unto heart. So at a later stage, about half or two-thirds of the way through the reading I plan to give you, I'm going to bring Brad up. And since we do the Psalms antiphonally in chapel, we're going to do the Psalm poems antiphonally. So that's a pleasure for you to look forward to. So just to begin this, I thought as Julie Andrews says, you know, begin at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. I happen to have a poem which begins with the word begin, though I'm not to begin the begin, that's a different thing. But I'm going to read a poem that begins with begin. And this is a poem which I thought I was writing about how to write poetry, which fair enough. But by the time I'd finished it, or it had kind of found itself in me, I realized I was writing about prayer. And that was a real breakthrough for me, because my twin vocations, as it were, as priest and poet, I sometimes had felt at earlier stages in my life were pulling in different directions. And I was afraid that I was robbing Peter to pay Paul, you know. And writing that particular poem, The Singing Bowl, was part of realizing that they were two sides of the same the same coin. They weren't pulling in different directions. Even though it's a poem which doesn't have very specific scriptural references at all, unusually for me. In fact, it turns its central images, you can see a picture of it on the front here, these beautiful Tibetan singing bowls, which are so beautifully made and wrought that they're intrinsically resonant. And you can kind of woo them into sound. You don't even have to strike them with a beater. You just run this thing around the edge like you would your finger around a wine glass to make it, and they sort of tremble into sound. So I wrote this song. The little prompt, this poem, the little prompt, or one of the little prompts was, I have such a singing bowl. And I was in the habit occasionally, if I tried to keep some discipline in my life, of having some space and quiet and emptiness to sort of get the sound of the singing bowl, meditate and begin my meditations on what it is to be in Christ. And I was allowing myself to get way too busy and rushing here and there. And I had foolishly put the singing bowl on a table near the front door. So you know what happens to any receptacle on a table near a front door. You know, all the stuff gets in. And once I was going, I just need to hear my singing bowl. And I'm going like, and it's going, you know, I'm going, what was that? And I realized the singing bowl is full. So why isn't my singing bowl ringing? It's full. I'm start emptying the singing bowl of all the clutter and detritus of every day. I'm thinking, oh, I get it. So that partly was what rose into this. But classical poets often started by invoking the muse and saying, oh, muse, sing about this, this, and this. Well, nowadays you can't snap your finger and ask your muse to do that stuff. More or less, she comes and tells you to sit down, shut up, and listen. And that's exactly what my muse does here. So here we are, the singing bowl. Begin the song exactly where you are. Remain within the world of which you're made. Call nothing common in the earth or air. Accept it all and let it be for good. Start with the very breath you breathe in now, this moment's pulse, this rhythm in your blood, and listen to it, ringing, soft and low. Stay with the music. Words will come in time. Slow down your breathing. Keep it deep and slow. Become an open singing bowl whose chime is richness rising out of emptiness and timelessness resounding into time. And when the heart is full of quietness, begin the song exactly where you are. So I made that the title, as it were, of a collection of poems I'd written over the years. And it was partly, I realized one of the things that had held me back as a poet in my own development was not being where I was. I first wanted to be a poet when I read the poetry of Keats. I was dragged to Keats' house by an improving aunt who thought, you know, I should spend my holidays being improved. And I had no idea who Keats was. And I was just nothing else to do, stood around in the house. They happened to have the Ode to the Nightingale written up on the wall. In fact, it was Keats's manuscript. As you in the room where the magic casements opened, where the tree was that the nightingale sang in. So having nothing better to do, I started reading it. And I was a really moody, you know, annoyed, self-involved, grumpy adolescent. And I didn't want to be there, and I was full of, you know, and so I started reading this poem, and like, as you know, it's got one of the most unpromising openings of any English poem. It goes, my heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and lethe words had sunk. And I'm going, yeah, dull, drains, ache, sunk. Man, you had me on ache. You know, I'm going, yeah, I'm totally, no. So I'm going, he's as moody as I am, this is great. And then lethe words had sunk. You've sunk down now to the word sunk, having gone from ache through dull and so on. And then suddenly, out of nowhere and for no apparent reason, the next line, the poem changes. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer with a full-throated ease. I'm being like, what was that? Melodious plot of beech and green and shadows. Nathan was tasty, it was so good. And then you remember the poem becomes ever more intensely beautiful and musical and sensual as you go through the verses. It's dusk, he goes outside to try and figure out hear the nightingale, and he goes out through those windows. You remember the bit where he goes, I cannot tell what flowers are at my feet, or what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows the fruit tree. And it's wonderful. It goes on. And he sees the queen, he says that wonderful thing to be ripped off later by Fitzgerald. Already with thee, tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne. And then out of nowhere, when you're just in this richly sensual thing, suddenly this biblical figure of a Ruth arises. He said, thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread thee down. And he starts to remember all the people who might have heard the nightingale. And he wonders if that song found its way into the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amidst the alien corn. I was really homesick. I was stuck in an English boarding school. I didn't want to be there. And then, no logical sequence, but he says the same song that Ruth heard hath often, he says, charmed open magic casements, opening on perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. And then he brings you back forward. So like at the back of this poem are these windows opening on to something utterly mysterious. And I began to find that was at the back of, so I was just, after that, I was a total Keats wannabe. I was just reading everything. And what I loved and read was the music in it. And I wrote really bad, slushy, would-be Keats poem. I was like the kid at the back of the Eric Clapton concert playing air guitar, wondering, how do you do that? And of course, I immediately stopped being where I was. I said, so why was I not born in 1795? What was so great about 1957? I could have been a young man in Keats' age. They wore waistcoats, they had slightly long hair, they read poems, what's not to like? And so I wanted to be Keats, and I wanted to be Byron, and I wanted to be Shelley. And the result of that, of course, was I was writing like them. But my poetry, although I was learning the rhythm and the music, and I was learning how to use rhyme, it was full of quiths and proths and doths and quithies and, all these kind of ridiculous archaisms. And I would never say green mountains if I could say mountains green. And it was what I was writing was pastiche. And yet I was hearing a music. So then I had the much harder, when I finally became a poet, I had to learn how to hear that music and how to make that music sing and ring in my poetry, but with me, where I am now. I could summon them, I could get them to help me, but I had to be where I am now and think about that and begin the song exactly where I am, and yet music was important. So, but I still wanted at some point, when I'd gone sufficiently far past the pastiche stage, to acknowledge where some of that came from. I loved Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. I loved Keats's Ode to Autumn. I found myself up in Durham and walking along the banks of the River Wear, just enjoying the autumn. And so I wrote, I hope it's in here, we'll find it. I wrote a poem in which I used Keats's very beautiful rhyming method, where he often, instead of rhyming couplets is A, B, B, C, C. Quatrains is A, B, C, D, where C or A is the same rhyming sound, right? Keats would go A, B, C, so no rhymes at all. You think, oh, he's not. And then he would go A, B, C. But there's a long gap, and this kind of faint chime of the music comes in. So I thought I would try Keats's meter and that rhyming scheme, but finally write a poem as far as I could about the same thing. That is to say, beauty. In the end, what Keats gives you is sheer beauty. But it's a beauty which is so at once sensuous and unearthly that you feel something calling you through the beauty. So I wrote this poem, which is a kind of, I suppose, a kind of Keats truth. And this is called, "And Is It Not Enough?" And is it not enough that every year a richly laden autumn should unfold and shimmer into being, leaf by leaf, its scattered ochres mirrored everywhere in hints and glints of hidden red and gold, threaded like memory through loss and grief? When dusk descends, when branches are unveiled, when roots reach deeper than our minds can feel and ready us for winter with strange calm, that I should see the inner tree revealed and know its beauty as the bright leaves fall and feel its truth within me as I am. And is it not enough that I should walk through low November mist along the bank, when scents of wood smoke summon in some long and melancholy undertone the talk of those old poets from whose works I drank the heady wine of an autumnal song? It is not yet enough. So I must try, in my poor turn, to help you see it too, as though these leaves could be as rich as those, that red and gold might glimmer in your eye, that autumn might unfold again in you, feeling with me what falling leaves disclose. So that sort of memory, thank you. I didn't know when I started that poem, I was just going to indulge myself and let myself write a beautiful autumnal poem and just be unashamedly musical and beautiful and not cynical and weird, which is what you're supposed to be. You know. But I didn't realize that what came out of that was a thing about why should you write poetry at all? That it's hard to, you see something and it's so beautiful or it's so true or you want somebody else to see it with you. And you make this extraordinary, you cast this little net of words and hope that all these living impulses will somehow be gathered into it and then set free to swim in the mind of another person. I actually think, and speaking of nets and fishing, there's a lot of really good poets write about fishing or enjoy fishing, or people with poetic minds. I mean, Ted Hughes in particular was one such, wrote a lot about fishing, And I sometimes think that my own process as a poet is a little bit like that I'm sitting patiently, as it were, at the pool of language, and I'm waiting, I'm fishing, waiting for something to take a bite. I'm waiting, quite literally, for the line to tauten, the slack line of my writing to tauten, because something is happening. But, like most fishermen will find, not that I'm by any means, you reel it in, oh great, I've got a live one, and it's a little tiddler. And and it hasn't, and it's flapping around, But at least it's alive. At least it's pushing back. But it's not quite right. You've got a few jottings in your notebooks, and then you slip it back into the pool of language, but you don't forget it. And then, 3 months later, that little tiddler has grown, and it comes back to you, and you've got something really worth having. You've got a keeper, So that's one analogy. There are lots of other analogies. I've never written a poem saying that, using the analogy of fishing, because I'm not a proper fisherman. And if you're not a proper fisherman and you try to write a fishing poem, you're finished, because proper fishermen will tell you. But I have had other, in fact, I'm using this one, I have had other metaphors which have helped me to think about the act of writing itself. Now, that's partly because when I often do readings, obviously I do readings all over the place, but I read quite often. I like to read in schools. I like to be with kids, and kids in primary schools are really good because they're not ashamed of asking very direct questions like, how do you write a poem? And how do you start? What do you do? And I often tell these kids that I'll usually wait, and a line will come. I hear a sound first, and then a line will come to me that somehow, stay with the music, words will come in time. I get a line, I'm not sure what it's about, but I have a feeling it's alive, it's a good line. So as I say to these kids, I write the line down in my notebook. I mostly write in a little house at the bottom of my garden, so nobody's looking. And I say to the kids, I've got this one line, right? I don't know what's going on. If nobody's looking, I'll lift the book up to my head and I'll go, I'll say to the words in my line, I'll say, have you got any friends? And it looks true. It's like, I know those words are going to pull something else in that, I've really got to listen. And I mean, the only thing which gives me the temerity to write as a poet, in my small and slender experience of life, is the conviction that all the words I use are older and wiser than I am. They've been around, now, in this way, I'm very, very different from T.S. Eliot in lots of ways, obviously, including talent. But when Eliot talks about his personal relationship with words, it's like he's some kind of amazing sergeant major or crack general, He describes writing poetry as making raids on the inarticulate with shabby equipment, always deteriorating in the general mess of imprecision of feeling. And then he goes, words slip, slide, decay with imprecision, would not stay in place, will not stay still. It's like you really don't want to be a word in a line in a poem of T.S. Eliot. Because every time you slack off slightly, he's coming down the thing with his whip. Get back in place, get back in place. Okay, boys, we're going over the top, and we're raiding the... Now, okay, Eliot can do that. Eliot can do that because he's T.S. Eliot and he's the marshal and general of the field. I can't do that. By contrast, my relationship with words is a bit more like this. I feel like when I'm thinking about a poem and thinking about where it might go, I'm like a sort of genial host planning a dinner party and thinking about his various guests and thinking like, which word should I've got all these great words, they're bringing their friends, the other words, we're going to get somewhere here. But I want to get the best conversation out of them. I want to get the best out of them. So where am I going to seat them? I will seat these two people quite different. Or look here, these two words have not sat next together in a line of English poetry since they met at the end of a John Donne sonnet in 1608. Maybe they've got a bit of catching up to do. So I kind of do that. So in the end, I thought I'd better write a poem that tries to set a little bit of that in place. So this is a sonnet called Hospitality. I turn a certain key within its wards, unlock my doors, and set them open wide to entertain a company of words. While some come early and with eager stride, others must be enticed and coaxed a little, the shy and rare, unused to company, who'll need some time to feel at home and settle. I bid them welcome all. I make them free of all that's mine, and they are good to me. I set them in the order they like best and listen for their wisdom. Try to learn as each unfolds the other's mystery. And though we know each word is my free guest, they sometimes leave a poem in return. So that's kind of how it works. Now, of course, if you feel like that about words, if you love words, if you love language, and I think that's probably the thing that most qualifies a poet is in love with language itself, the very sound of it. Every word counts, and you can, in the way that an artist is in love with paint and a sculptor is in love with stone or bronze or brass. Your medium is dear to you. And it's a very visceral and kind of intimate relationship. You care about words. So opposite the poem about hospitality in my book, Parable and Paradox, is a poem called A Lament for Lost Words. And it says, on learning that certain words had been culled from the Oxford Junior Dictionary. Now, it's my friend, the great writer, great nature writer, Robert Macfarlane, who first pointed this out. He wrote a little article in The Guardian quite a number of years ago now, where he'd been sent to review the Oxford Junior Dictionary, which is a 2-volume thing. It's a very important book because it's not the massive Oxford, 26 volumes, and it's not, but it's aimed particularly at kids in high school, teenagers and slightly younger, and it's meant to give them a sense of how to use a dictionary, how to love it, how to care about those things. But it's a physically printed book in 2 volumes. So it's finite, and therefore, obviously, as we have neologisms, we have new words, it's important to bring those in. They have to leave some out in order to... Now, apparently, instead of making... I don't know if we forgive them or blame them for this. They used a computer algorithm to do it. They got an artificial intelligence, as it were, in its infant stage, to search all the books and texts and, online material likely to be read by their age group. and gave positive marks, as it were, to the words that most frequently occurred there, and lower marks to the words that didn't. And that's how they came up with the appalling result that they did. Not realizing that you actually, if it's a dictionary, you actually want the words the kids are less familiar with, to say. But Robert and I now know that's how they did it, but at the time we thought it might even have been a human judgment. So in this article, as Dickens said, that sometimes just describing a thing is enough to bring it down. Just describing it. In this article, Robert Macfarlane listed in alphabetical order some of the words which were culled, and culled was the word they used, which were deemed no longer necessary to have in a dictionary, no longer of any use or relevance to the rising generation. Those words included acorn, adder, ash, beech, bluebell, buttercup, catkin, conker, cowslip, cygnet, dandelion, fern. Notice there's a kind of thread of a connection here. Dandelion, fern, hazel, heron, kingfisher, mistletoe, nectar, otter, pasture, willow. And it's like, really? And I was so kind of wound up with this. I don't normally write poems in haste, but that evening I wrote a sonnet, which I'm going to read you, called Lament for Lost Words. At some point or another, I sent it to Rob Macfarlane, and he subsequently did an astonishing thing. He wrote a book called The Lost Words. He wrote this beautiful, enchanting children's book with all the words that they weren't allowed in it, and with beautiful illustrations where they could see the letters of the word and piece them together, and wonderful acrostic evocations of the animals and plants with it spelled out. He did a fantastic thing, but I possibly got the ball rolling with this. So it's called A Lament for Lost Words. To graceful names and lovely woods, farewell. To acorn, adder, ash, to beech and bluebell, farewell, old friends. I name you in my sonnet. Buttercup, catkin, conker, cowslip, cygnet. Farewell. Your fields are brick, our books are barren. No dandelion or fern, hazel or heron. We'll go no more alone, no more together. The mountain thyme is gone, and gone the heather. The clinging ivy's gone, and soon to go. The kingfisher's blue bolt, the mistletoe, nectar, newt, and otter, pasture, willow. To their last rites, my muse comes, footing slow. We'll hear no more the heaven-scaling lark. We'll all go down together in the dark. Cheery little poem. But anyway, now happily, Oxford have repented of their ways. It always gives a Cambridge man great pleasure to say, Oxford has repented of their ways, I'm sure you guys have similar rivalries, even though it's different, There's a nice story. I don't know if you ever looked at the shields of the two universities, which always appear on the spines of the books that they're different presses, Oxford University Press and Cambridge. So, as you know, the Oxford emblem is an open book, which is clearly a Bible, because it has a verse, indeed the opening verse of Psalm 27 in Latin on it, Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my light. The Cambridge University Press has a big book, possibly a Bible, which is closed. So the classic trope is the Oxford guy runs into the Cambridge guy and thinks, I'm going to wind this guy up. And he says, well, you can tell everything about the difference between our two universities by just looking at these two emblems, Our book is open and we're open to learning. Learning is a closed book to you. So without a turn of a minute, the Cambridge man replies to me and he says, well, that's really interesting you should mention that, because I've been looking very closely at these two things, and I noticed that your book is always open at the same page. Our book is closed because we've actually read it. So I just had to get that in. So some of my poetry, like most poets' poetry, has something about the delight in language and in words itself. And in fact, in in this book, The Singing Bowl, I've got a whole section which is really about the joy of language, about words themselves. And I've got a poem in this which is called Spell. And I suppose it was just by noting that the thing I was very bad at school, spelling and learning how to spell, was also the thing that made my heart most leap when I read books of magic, a book of spells, a spell for the refreshment of the spirit. And I learned later that, there's a reason for that, because the fact that spell and spell are the same word is to do with a much earlier, and in my view, entirely correct view, that language is magic. That it is something extraordinary and magical, that you can mix these letters and come up with these words, and that the words summon and evoke whole worlds. And I am absolutely convinced that language, and especially language, there is a relationship between the word chant and enchant, for example. And in fact, grammary, which relates to the word grammary, a grimoire or a book of grammary was a book of spells and enchantments as well. And I'm thoroughly convinced that these words are, that spelling eventually and making letters and making words and trying to make poems that chant and sing is magical, because I can tell you, I spent years writing these poems quietly in the little hut at the bottom of my garden and basically sharing them with my wife, my mother, and my dog. That was my extensive readership for a long time. But I kept putting them out there and seeing them, and eventually other people read. And it's only because I wrote these spells and enchantments that astonishingly silver wings lifted me up and raised me and carried me across the Atlantic and brought me to you. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for those strange combinations of letters. So anyway, I just thought I'd write a poem called Spell, just marveling at these 26 letters that we have. The other thing that's really encouraging, if you recognize that all the words are composed simply out of those letters, which you have available to you at any time. Every time you sit down to write, you've got the exact same toolkit as Shakespeare. Like, you're bound to strike it lucky sometime, So this is a poem called Spell. Summon the summoners, the 26 enchanters, spelling silence into sound. They bind and loose, they find and are not found. Recall the river tongues from Alf to Styx. Summon the summoners, the shaping shapes, the grounds of sound, the generative grammar, runes from the root tree, written in the deeps, leaves from the tail tree, lifted swift and free, shining, recombining in their dance, the genesis of every utterance, pattering the patterns of the tree. Summon the summoners and let them sing. The summoners will summon everything. Now, you'll see there that I'm partly playing on spell and runes and root trees, but I'm also, by my choice of the word Genesis, recalling that in our great story, the world is spoken into being. Let there be light, and there was light. Let this be, and it is. That is the primal experience, of which we have a secondary sub-creative experience when we're writers, that we say the words and it's there. There it is. We summon stuff. That's what we do. And we do it because we are made in the image of a maker. As Tolkien says, we make still by the law by which we're made. So I have never lost my sense of the magical element in language, but I now think of it as not only magical, but as in some sense sacramental. And I'm very concerned that we take this gift that we've been given and baptize it and bless it and let it be used in different ways. I once went on a retreat whose sole purpose was to try and help me prioritize and actually get down into a single sentence what it was I thought I was on earth to do. I did this just towards the end of the 90s when I was involved in really, really demanding parish ministry, but also because it goes with the established church, and I'm being a vicar in a couple of parishes. It turned out I was the chair of 16 different committees. I mean, I should never be the chair of anything, you know. I'm a natural disruptor, you know. But anyway, I went with the gig. Anyway, I finally figured out this thing, and I went, and the sentence that I got at the end of this process of discernment and prayer and reading scriptures and talking about the Christians you most admired and stuff was simple. It was, and as soon as I read it, it was blindingly obvious, but I'd not seen it. It had been pushed to the side of my life. I'd not been writing for ages or even reading. I'd just been toiling in the vineyard. And my sentence was to use my love of language and facility for it to kindle my own and other people's imaginations for Christ. In fact, that ended up finding what the connection between Christ and imagination was, and some of the stuff I'm teaching you in these 3 days comes out of that. But it was really good, because then I could say, like, would I like to chair the subcommittee on the such and that? No, does that kindle the imagination for Christ? Au contraire. You know? So, of course, you've got to do some stuff that's not core. You know, I belong to a household. Taking out the garbage is important. It doesn't kindle my imagination for Christ. Although, you could get a great sermon out of it if you really want to think about it, because Golgotha was the rubbish dump, and, you know, anyway, we won't go there. But, so I care about words, and I have a sense of their magic, and I wanted really to start this reading with some of that stuff. But I'm probably better known as a sort of, insofar as I'm a kind of bard of a tribe. My tribe is the story keepers, is all of you. It's the people who still think the Christian faith is relevant, who think something happened in Christ that changed everything, who think in one way or another, however hard it is to articulate, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. And the first published book I had was a book called Sounding the Seasons, in which I went through the whole cycle of the church year. And of course, in doing so, you tell the salvation story. You tell what Christ has done for us. And maybe since we've just had Pentecost and Trinity. So maybe I'll just read you those two. It was really important to me that I wrote a sonnet called Trinity Sunday, because I've observed over many years that for some strange reason, when it gets to Trinity Sunday, the incumbent vicar, pastor, presbyter, or other person in charge is mysteriously absent. They get called away. And it turns out that it's the job of the curate, lay preacher, assistant, trainee student, or whoever it is, to preach the sermon on the mystery of the Holy and Undivided Trinity. And no shamrocks have been hurt in the course of this day. So I thought, whatever else I do, I've got to have a sermon for Trinity Sunday. And then I discovered that George Herbert got there first, and he already had it. He wrote a good one for Trinity Sunday as well, but I wrote one too. But obviously that's preceded by Pentecost. So I'll just to give you a little taster of this. But then I want to go on, and particularly when we get Brad up, I want to share the sort of Psalms project that we did. But here's the Pentecost poem first. I had noticed when I was contemplating this Pentecost poem that I was just thinking about the rich poetic imagery of Scripture. And I realized, well, that's really interesting. What are the symbols? What are the emblems? What are the elements, you might say, of the Holy Spirit? Taking the whole arc of Scripture, including the Old Testament, because, of course, Holy Spirit gets in there really early. The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the deep. Well, obviously, Spirit, pneuma, ruach, is breath, wind, air. So clearly the air is there. And then at Pentecost, there are the flames of fire, the tongues of fire. There's the fire that doesn't consume. So clearly fire is an element of the Holy Spirit. And then the springs, the streams that make glad the city of God. I will give you a fountain welling up in your heart to eternal life. The beautiful loosening streams of water, and of course the water of baptism. And Jesus standing in the Jordan and the dove. So I was thinking, that's really interesting. Fire, air, water. There could be a band name in there somewhere. But in fact, of course, well, those are three of the great four elements which the classical and biblical world believe the whole world to be composed of. And I was going like, so whatever happened to the earth? Why doesn't the earth get this gig? You know, the earth, where's the earth? And I was thinking, why is there no? I thought, you could never have the earth as a symbol of the Spirit. What's missing? And then it suddenly dawned on me, I'd never seen this in a pair of little brain. Earth, of course, is the name of humankind. Adam, the person of red clay, yeah? Adam Kadmon. So I get it now. He forms us from the dust of the ground, but we're not dust. We may be reduced to it, but we're moist and we've got a spark of life in us. And of course, the first thing he does when he forms the person out of clay, out of the dust of the ground, but it's already got to have moisture in it. And then he breathes the spirit into the person. They become a living being. And then, you know, he is the light that lightens everyone that comes into the world. So I thought, oh, that's really interesting. We're incomplete. We're only one of the four. We're only a quarter of what we should be without the Holy Spirit that's coming in. So that kind of drove this poem a little bit. Plus, of course, the theme of translation. So, Pentecost. Today we feel the wind beneath our wings. Today the hidden fountain flows and plays. Today the church draws breath at last and sings as every flame becomes a tongue of praise. This is the feast of fire, air and water, poured out and breathed and kindled into earth. The earth herself awakens to her maker, translated out of death and into birth. The right words come today in their right order, and every word spells freedom and release. Today, the gospel crosses every border. All tongues are loosened by the Prince of Peace. Today, the lost are found in his translation, whose mother tongue is love in every nation. So it's just a sheer celebration of that. And then I thought, okay, I've got to do Trinity Sunday. The readings in the year that I wrote this were the very readings we had on Trinity Sunday here when I was at your Mass. I was so pleased, yes. So it's interesting, it's the Genesis reading, of course. It's in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, go right up to the creation of man. And that extraordinary grammatical faux pas by an inventive God, where he says, then he said, let us make man in our own image, in his image he made them, where you're shifting back and forth between the singular and the plural. And all the church fathers said, oh yeah, see what you did there. So that was the reading, and I thought, well, I'm going to start with that in the beginning. But then I'm going to think about how we are made in the image of the triune God. And so it goes like this. In the beginning, not in time or space, but in the quick before both space and time, in life, in love, in coherent grace, in three in one in three, in rhyme, in music, in the whole creation story, the triune poet makes us for his glory and makes us each the other's inspiration. He calls us out of darkness, chaos, chance, to improvise a music of our own, to sing the chord that calls us to the dance, 3 notes resounding from a single tone, to sing the end in whom we all begin, our God, beyond, beside us, and within. So that has, I hope, been the useful get out of jail card for hard-pressed curates since 2012. My most recent book is a book called David's Crown, and it's a series. It's almost like a prayer diary response to the Psalms thing. I began it in lockdown. On the first day, I was reading the first Psalm, and it was the first day, and we all went slightly crazy. And I happened to have been reading John Donne's beautiful sonnet sequence, La Corona, which a corona is a form. Corona, of course, means crown. That's why the virus got that name, because the crown-like things on it. And a corona is a corona because the last line of the first sonnet is the first line of the next one. And the last line of that one is the first line of the next one. But this is the good thing. The final line of the final sonnet is the first line of the first sonnet. So it's a crown. And the opening and closing line of Donne's sequence, addressed to Christ, is, deign at my hands this crown of prayer and praise. Receive this from me, Christ. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I did that? But with the Psalms, it'd be like 150. Really? But funnily enough, it just became very compelling. So I couldn't write the first line until I'd reread those final great Psalms and the great praise Psalm 150, which is really good because we were in dire circumstance. And the Psalm takes you on a roller coaster emotional ride, but you hit the skids, you hit rock bottom, don't you, at Psalm 88, which although it's not numerically in the middle of the Psalter, in terms of the number of verses, because of how long 119 is, it actually is. And that is the only psalm that doesn't finish with a yet or a nevertheless I'll praise you. It's just like, my friends and my companions and my lovers you put far from me and left me in darkness. Bang. End of. Then there's something of a response in 89. But it was good to know, it's like seeing the transfiguration before you go down to the crucifixion, that this joy was coming at the end. So I had to have a line that could be the climax and yet the invitation, and that line turned out to be, come to the place where every breath is praise. So I'm going to read you some of these psalms, but I was talking to Brad, and lo and behold, he's done the whole thing. So if I can get Brad up here, can we have a round of applause for our other poet? Now, we're going to read these psalms antiphonally. Now, I don't know how much we need or you need to be sort of reminded of the actual psalms. We're going to do 5 psalms between us. If you've got your little psalters on your phones, yeah, we're doing 1, 2, 19, 27, and 84. I thought we should do 84 because we had it. We sang that hymn based on it today, and it's so beautiful. So I'll just say a brief word about each psalm, but you know them, especially you know them here because you guys are hardcore liturgical Marines. You don't, you do the psalms every day, come hell or high water. So both of which you can encounter in the psalms. So I don't need to tell you that this opening one has these 2 ways. Blessed is the man that hath not walked in the counsel of the ungodly or sat in the seat of the scornful. But then, surprisingly, it gives you this most beautiful image of the tree. He shall be like a tree rooted beside the waters that bring forth his life. And there's the contrast with the chaff. I wrote this psalm. I wrote this poem in response to that psalm, having had a walk where I'd seen this beautiful, beautiful tree right by the waters, literally in the place where I live. And I came home and wrote this. Psalm 1, Beatus vir. Come to the place where every breath is praise, and God is breathing through each passing breeze. Be planted by the waterside, and raise your arms with Christ beneath these rooted trees, who lift their breathing leaves up to the skies. Be rooted too, as still and strong as these. Open alike to sun and rain. Arise from meditation by these waters. Bear the fruit of that deep rootedness. Be wise in the tree's long wisdom. Learn to share the secret of their patience. Pass the day in their green fastness and their quiet air. Slowly discern a life, a truth, a way where simple being flowers in delight. Then let the chaff of life just blow away. Tree's got to be a good thing for lockdown because it's not going anywhere and neither am I, But do you want to introduce your things or get straight? Yeah.
Just a brief introduction. This is Opening King David. It was a bridge project for me as I was making a life transition, and I decided to attempt to draft a poem a week for the next 3 years, responding one at a time to the Psalms, and that was my bridge project. I completed it on time, which is something of a miracle. And my concern was to bring to the writing process a focus on 3 horizons. One would be the horizon of the biblical text. Another would be the horizon of whatever was kicking around inside this particular skin I have on. And then the third horizon was the larger world in which I live, both nature and culture. I began the series not long after 9/11, and so there is that national trauma in the poems. I was not as concerned as Malcolm to try to recapture sort of the original spiritual essence of the Psalms as I was to be in a more frank and personally honest conversation with them. I grew up with the Psalms in the Episcopal Church, and this was my adult revisitation of them in my condition at the time. This first one from Psalm 1 is entitled Ashra, which is happy. This time, the collision wasn't fatal. I knocked the doe off the road and backed up to check. In my low beams, her head high, those giant black eyes blinked slowly, confused. Difficult this morning to concentrate on the psalmic text. Happy is the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord, which feels irrelevant to everything that has been flailing at my heart these days. But how else to learn an answer for how the tyranny of bleak appearances drains the soul of all will to persevere? He is a tree whose leaf does not wither. I am like chaff that the wind blows away.
No, that's very good. And there's that identifying with the chaff rather than tree. I have to say, when I was doing the Psalter, obviously there were Psalms when I was in exactly that place as well. I was going, oh my goodness, I can't say this. Like, how did Jesus ever say this? You know, crush them, the dogs will lick their blood, you know. You know. I'm always waiting for somebody to do one of those really, you know, the way they do lovely little sunsets and twee things, you know, and sweet, sweet little waterfalls, and a nice psalmic verse underneath, and they always choose the sweet bits. I really want a poster that has that beautiful scene, and then it says, and the dogs will lick their blood, you know. But, so I said, come to the place where every breath is praise, was my opening. My poem, for one, closed with, then let the chaff of life just blow away. And I always read the Psalms in pairs, because I knew my landing place also had to be my springboard, the first line. Now, as it happens, right there in the beginning of lockdown, all kinds of stuff's going on, and a friend of mine, in fact, an American friend, had ventured to say something about how we might, with charity, cope with this pandemic together. And she'd been shot down in flames by some people who denied that the thing was happening or all the way. And then she was subject to the most hideous Twitter storm of just vitriol. And she was really bruised and wounded, and she'd written to me about that. And I had to sit down, and guess what? The next psalm was, why do the nations rage? Why do the heathen make a vain noise? I was going, you're too right, I want to ask that question. So this was how this one came out. And as soon as I wrote this one, I knew that this wasn't going to be simply a quaint exercise in rephrasing Coverdale. This is going to be a conversation about now. So Psalm 2, Quaere fremuerint gentes, why do the heathen rage? Then let the chaff of life just blow away. The cynic scoffer and the evil troll, the hunters and the haters who hold sway in raging Twitter storms, the ones who scroll through hate and hit lists in their tiny rage, are dust upon the mirror of your soul. Blow them away, the idols of this age, and let their fury settle in the mire. Uncap your pen and open a clean page. For now the Lord will give you your desire and set you high upon his holy hill. He draws you to the garden through the fire, back to the fountain whence those waters spill that christened you as his beloved child, that you may find your peace in his goodwill. You'll see I stole a few lines from Dante there, but you get the vibe. Okay, so let's have number two.
So this poem predates Twitter. One of my favorite traditional folk songs in the American songbook is the song Hard Times that I came across in the recordings of Bob Dylan. And after 9/11, different kind of hard times for many. Hard times. We wait out this blizzard at the far edge of whatever suffering it may pile on the less well-kept. Easy for us to love the bride-white beauty through our airtight windows, or even brave the elements one well-plowed mile for $2 coffees at our favorite Zagat-rated cafe. Never without a log for our fireplace. We are thankful for the comforts, though we sign contracts for these benefits, insured by policies that conspire against all for whom there remains no room in the inn. Easy to feel the innkeeper's bind with the wind chill pushing 20 below.
Good. I'm wondering at our time, I think maybe we might skip 19 and go on to 27.
I love that one.
Oh, no, you want 19? Okay, no. Yeah, okay. Have you got time for 19? Yeah. 19 was C.S. Lewis's favorite psalm. So, you know, obviously that amazing thing about seeing the stars, and then the sun, rejoicing like a giant and like a bridegroom to run his course, and then the switch to the law of the Lord. I felt quite a weight doing this because Psalm 19 is one of my favorites, and I was very conscious it was Lewis's favorite too. 19. In that still place where earth and heaven meet, under mysterious starlight, raise your head and gaze up at their glory. The complete consort dancing, as one poet said of his own words. But these are all God's words, a shining poem, waiting to be read afresh in every heart. Now, look towards the brightening east and see the splendid sun rise and rejoice, the icon of his Lord's true light. Be joyful with him. Watch him run his course. Receive the treasure of his light, pouring like honeyed gold till day is done, as sweet and strong as all God's laws, as right as all his judgments, and as clean and pure, all given for your growth and your delight.
So, if all created things speak wordlessly of their creator, the turkeys waddle, then what do tax loopholes say about us? Or bombed out cities? The gossip of blue highways, quaint audible buzz, is it praise or lamentation? Could even these restless streams make glad the heart of God? Old Madeline, wind in the door, L'Engle, says all true art, looking death in the face and rising into light, feeds the river. Oh, to be able to hear unfiltered the riotous vertical tongues of trees and see beneath their cowled humility the fire that burns yet will not consume them.
Oh, I love that, the riotous vertical tongues of trees. Of course, that's the opening line, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. That's one of the things I've been trying to do in this course, is to talk about creation itself as a kind of poem that's speaking to us. There is no word or speech, and yet their message has gone out. So, 27. It's a favorite psalm of mine. It's a psalm of light. Dominus illuminatio, the Lord is my light and my salvation. But the bit that amazes me in Psalm 27 is tucked right, it's kind of about 2/3 of the way in. And when you think of its Old Testament context, it's pretty astonishing. My heart has said of him, seek his face. Your face, Lord, I will seek. This is in the same testament that says, no man sees my face and lives. This is, Moses can't see the face of God. He, in that rather quaint language, sees God's hinder parts. And even seeing the back of God, his face is illuminated. So it's forbidden to see the face of God. And yet it's running through the whole of the, I've got to see it, I've got to see it. And we know the one who saw it, who wrestled with God in the dark, but then knew what his face would look like, was the one who'd wronged his brother and went, and when the brother forgave, he said, my brother Esau, your face is like the face of God. Jacob should know. Anyway, this is my take on Psalm 27. Oh, let me see with his eyes from now on, whose gaze on beauty makes it beautiful, who looks us into love and looks upon his whole creation with a merciful and loving eye. My heart has said of him, seek out his face. I've sensed his bountiful presence shimmering behind the dim veil of things. That presence calls to me, calls me to tremble at the brink and rim of lived experience, and then to free myself of fear, to trust him, and to dive right off that brink into his mystery, into that deep and holy sea of love in which the living worlds all float and swim, to dare each moment's death that I might live. So, 27.
This particular psalm, when I was reading it, thoroughly intimidated me. And I have, one of my spiritual gifts is self-pity. And so I had to, reading the psalm, I was sort of beset upon by self-pity. I don't remember why exactly. But I knew that I wanted to dig my way out from underneath that. But in order to do that, I kind of had to look self-pity in the face. To self-pity. What a force you are. Cyclonic, godlike, irresistible as lust is irresistible, and thick with generations of flung wreckage, blunt as thugs. Who, coracled by mere feeling, can stand against such compelling torque? I confess you are a familiar ride, a drug of choice, a sluttish changeling, your blouse half unbuttoned, eyes fierce with loathing. Where in my soul's fluid world currents meet, there, turning on the slightest axis of an insecurity, you, siren vortex, draw me into your sweet, insatiable self. Old friend and nemesis, there too a rock of refuge may be found. To him I cleave.
It's a lovely turn at the end, isn't it? The kind of, in the swirling self-pity, the rock. I just thought we should throw in Psalm 84 because it was such a pleasure to sing that metrical version of it just now in chapel. And of course, how amiable are thy dwellings, O Lord of hosts. My soul hath a longing and a yearning. The swallow hath found her a nest, even in thy courts. So I was writing all this during lockdown, and we were literally locked out of our churches. And I already read a poem to you yesterday about how that felt at Easter. But finally, we were allowed back in church, but not for services. So, but at least the door was unlocked, and you could go. And I like just going to old churches, and fortunately England is full of, beautiful little medieval parish churches that almost nobody goes to, and that's on a Sunday, And, but you could get in, and our village church is very beautiful, and I spent a day there just repairing, really, and trying to heal up a bit from the ravages of all of that stuff we went through. So quam delecta, how delightful, how delectable are your dwelling places. This is my take on Psalm 84. And I feel, sorry, I make a slight swipe about the abstractions of theology, and I know we have some theologians in our midst, so please don't take it personally when I say architecture is as good as you. Right, okay, Psalm 84. Yahweh saves, our God is merciful. And how I long to enter in his courts, to nestle at his altar, and to dwell with him forever. Day and night my thoughts are yearning towards the beauty of his temple in swallow flights of song. For in his courts, time is transfigured, opened out, and ample. It touches on eternity. I stay a while within this quiet church. Its simple furnishings and storied windows say more to me of heaven than the pale abstractions of theology. A day spent in an empty church has been as full of goodness as an age elsewhere. I feel its peace refresh me like a holy well.
This is entitled Better Far. I am a speck lodged in the hem of a garment, dust in the tight weave of a fabric, draped sari-like around the divinity beyond imagining, whose nature limits his wardrobe to what is of love and lovely beyond whatever we may mean by beautiful. Suspended here, I am ecstatic. Though cancer and suicide have taken friends and former students, and ideologues everywhere stain the air with their maniacal raving, not a day passes without my grateful amazement that I have not been swept from my small place by some fastidious hand that knows a hitchhiking piece of lint from an integral thread. Better far this hour than never to have been.
Oh, that's a beautiful ending. That's lovely. So, ladies and gentlemen, Brad Davis. I'll just do a closing poem by way of sort of tying it up, and then we'll have a little time for questions and answers and reflections, and Brad may want to join in that too. So confession is good for the soul. This poem is a kind of form of confession. This is a true story. It happened, I was supposed to give a talk on poetry, partly illustrated by my own poems, and I forgot to get the handouts done in time. So I thought, oh, no worry, the college will have a reprographics room or a photocopying room or something. And I'll go in there. It'll either be a really simple photocopier like the ones where it's just really, there's only, you lift up the lid and there's one button and it helpfully says copy, or if it's more complicated, somebody will help me, right? So I go into this room and it's a ridiculous machine. You couldn't actually tell which end was which. It had so many trays on both sides. As I said to it, looked more like a Hindu god than a machine, Anyway, there was nobody there, and it was really before my lecture, so I put a little poetry in at one end, what I thought must be the thing, and I hopefully pressed the biggest button, and it seemed to work. The poetry went inside the machine, and then more poetry came out the other end, and then suddenly there was this horrible grinding sound, and the whole thing completely ground to a halt, and they all started messaging me and going jam in level C, open door A, and the bell was going for the lecture, so I just took what I could of these mangled and inadequate handouts and fled the scene and went and gave my talk with my inadequate handouts. But of course I had to go back past this open door after the lecture was over, so I was going back, and lo and behold, there was a woman there now, and she was there. She's quite tall, kind of robust-looking person, and she was holding one of my crumpled poems in her hand, and she pointed a finger at me and she said, "Your poetry is jamming my machine." And I thought, that's such a good line. You know, obviously, I didn't say that, you know, I'm terribly sorry, you know. So we went down and we literally knelt in front of this thing and opened it all up, and she managed to get my poetry out of the gubbins of it and everything, and I said I was terribly sorry, and so, well, next time, you know. And so I was leaving, and then I turned around and I noticed she was uncrumpling one of my poems and reading it. So I thought, yes. So I thought she deserved a poem, and I wrote this. I thought, like, what form of poem shall I write? So I thought it's got to be a villanelle, because a villanelle, as you know, has two lines separated at the beginning, and then the first of those two lines gets to the end of the second verse, and the second at the end of the third verse, and they get reproduced. I mean, it is a poem which literally photocopies itself. So I thought it's got to be right. So I'll see if I can remember this one rather than going back to the book. So it goes like this. My poetry is jamming your machine. It broke the photocopier. I'm to blame, with pictures copied from a world unseen. My poem is in the works. I'm on the scene. We free my verse, and I confess my shame. My poetry is jamming your machine. Though you berate me with what might have been, you stop to read the poem just the same. And pictures copied from a world unseen subvert the icons on your mental screen and open windows with a whispered name. My poetry is jamming your machine, for chosen words can change the things they mean and set the once familiar world aflame with pictures copied from a world unseen. The mental props give way on which you lean. The world you see will never be the same. My poetry is jamming your machine with pictures copied from a world unseen. So thank you very much for listening to that.
Father Malcolm, thank you so much. We do have some time for some question and answer, and I wonder if Brad would come back up. We have a chair right here for you.
Are you mic for sound, Brad? You may need to go there for the microphone.
Yeah. Well, what we're going to do is I think we've got time for a few questions, and I wonder if you have a question for Brad or Malcolm, if you would just raise your hand right now. Okay. I see one back there. Sure. We got more than one, guys, right? Come on. All right, we got two. I got two over here. Can I get a third? We can make this into an auction. Where? Did you see one? No. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you three, come up here. Come on up here. So we're recording this. We want to capture your question. So I'd like you to ask your question into the microphone. Okay?
And tell us which of it's for, if it's for one of us.
Yes. Yes. Why don't you go first?
Hello. I would like to ask both of you about editing poems. So you mentioned, Malcolm, you mentioned Eliot. I'm currently making my way through The Wasteland. Oh, wow. And apparently it didn't start April is the cruelest month. That was actually the 160th. Yeah. About a third of the poem was gone from Ezra Pound, his friend, and I think his first wife.
Yeah, Ezra Pound was the editor in that case, yeah.
They took, The Wasteland went through many iterations. How many iterations does your poetry go through before we get to read it?
Okay, it's a very good question. You're right about the editing job that Pound did. The original title of The Wasteland was He Do the Police in Different Voices, which I just don't think would have cut it, you know. But then, you know, Frodo in the original draft of The Lord of the Rings was called Bungo, and Strider was called Trotter, so that gives you hope. But look, here's my microphone. I think we can do it this way. Do you want to talk about your editing process?
My poems come straight from heaven. A poem will take anywhere between a day if I'm really lucky, and a few months. I go through a process, a threefold process. It begins with improvisation, and then I take what I've generate it in the improvisation stage, and then I compose it. I compose it into a form that is preliminary. And then I go about a process of revision that I love. Revision is almost my favorite part of the process because there's so much to discover, and a good reader, I always turn to a good reader for some help. A good reader will help you realize where the dross is, and you get to beat it out of the poem.
I also think there's a distinction between the creative flow, writing first, and the editing. It's a different mindset. And if you have your editor's cap on too quickly, you freeze what you're going to do. You can't play and let it go. You have to flow first. Obviously, I'm concerned with form, so I'm actually using meter and rhyme, and to some degree, I've internalized those forms now. They're almost like a metrical muscle memory for me, so I can do them. But I do revise. I tend never to. I write poems out by hand, and then the next day, I type them into my word processor, and in the very act of doing that and seeing them in that, I end up revising. And then I print it out, because I'm not a digital native and I can't revise too much. And then I've got a typescript to move around and do things with. Sometimes poems come, sometimes they come perfectly formed and I go like, I can't do anything with this. But sometimes they need licking into shape. Now, when I say licking into shape, I'm borrowing from a really serious poet, to wit, Virgil. Virgil, in one of his poems, describes the work of the poet as like a mother bear licking the cub in shape. Now, that phrase, they actually thought, they didn't understand really about, licking off the... They literally thought, because they saw this squishy mess, that the bear cubs or the calves were born misshapen, like basically there but not quite right. And they actually thought that the mother was literally shaping and forming them into the way they're literally licking them into shape. And it's just brilliant. So you can see a poet going, yeah, because I've got to taste the poet in my tongue. My tongue itself, the language is helping to shape the poems. So there's always that final shaping. Hope that helps. Okay.
Thank you both very, very much. This is so small. Brad, I know your poems are divinely imparted, and so this was a question about draftsmanship and workmanship. I'm curious, maybe we'll do a two-part question. Is one, can you talk a little bit about the process? Does your poetry writing, do you find you have to have a time and a place and an intention, like I'm going to do this with a goal over 3 years, or do they sometimes come all together? I'm just curious about that workmanship side of it. And then maybe just a little bit more towards the heart, for the person here who's has an artistic impulse, and yet maybe they come from a family context where that's never been honored or called forth, what might you say to that person to either encourage them or something like that?
So two very good questions. I think the process is kind of different for everybody. I do think you have to show up. The great temptation for any writer is to spend most of your genial imaginative power imagining having already written the poem. You imagine the fantastic reviews and the accolade, and you're going like, that thing he wrote, and you go, wait a minute, I haven't written it yet. Like, you leap to the completion and you try to avoid the labor. But isn't that true of our moral life as well? So you have to stop imagining that, and you have to invest your imagination entirely into the thing and let the thing flow. But as I said in the poems about words, a lot of my process as a poet is more about receiving than about, making up. I really get the sense that there's certain poems that want to be written, or that once I've got the words together, they desire to be in a certain order, and I'm just helping them to do that. So I'm listening to the poem, I'm trying to serve the poem, and very often the poem is a different poem from the one I wanted to write. I know I've got a poem, like as I said to people before, if I have a clear idea of what the poem's going to be about, even if it's a biblical poem based on this psalm or on this saying of Jesus, if I think the poem's going to say something like this, and then that's exactly what it says and no more, then it's not a poem, it's a note to self. It's only when the poem kicks back and says, no, write me this way, that's when I know I've got a poem. And then that's very exciting, because I'm as much on the edge of my seat as I hope the reader is. So I like, goodness, what happened next, And sometimes that's really dramatic. When I wrote what became the opening poem in the sequence parable and paradox on the sayings of Jesus. I mean, I'd written the first one about the grain of wheat, but I thought I must. So I wanted to do on Jesus saying, "He that hath ears to hear, let them hear." And my idea, I'm ashamed to confess this, my dumb and presumptuous idea at the beginning of that poem was to take Coleridge's phrase about the film of familiarity, and you need to take it off nature. And I thought, hey, what Coleridge did for nature, I could do for the Bible. And, hey, it's all too familiar and dulled. My poetry is going to sharpen it up and make it new. I thought, God, it's so embarrassing. Anyway, so I started to write the poem like that, right? The thin, familiar film. And the poem is going, are you kidding? Yeah. And suddenly out of nowhere, from the poem, comes the image of Lazarus, wrapped up in all his bandages, and Jesus saying, unbind him. And then I suddenly realized that the image of Scripture in Scripture is not something gauzy and wrapped up, but it's something that cuts through wrappings. It's the sharp as the two-edged sword. And by the end of the poem, I'm begging the Scripture to unwrap me, and never presuming that I'm going to unwrap the Scripture. And the poem taught me that. I mean, and if I hadn't written it, I wouldn't have known it. So that's what I'm always looking for, is the poem kicking back. What would I say to the person who's got the urge to write? I would say, write. Just show up. I have a little hut, which I call my trysting place, my place of trysting with the muse. And I show up regularly, and almost always she says, "Not tonight, dear. I'm washing my hair." It's not going to happen. But at least I showed up. And if there happened to be some blessed time when she was in the mood, at least I'd be there. And I can always doodle in the meantime, So that's basically what I do. I show up. And I don't think anybody should be put off by the fact that most of my poetry for most of my life was read by me and my immediate family. There's poems in that book that sat there for 20 years with nobody noticing. I started wanting to be a poet at the age of 16, and I kept at it. I didn't publish my first book of poetry till I was in my 50s. Now, in order for that to happen, I had to think it was worth doing in itself and of itself. And it was, to me, almost the language was saying, hey, I'd like to be arranged like this. It's more comfortable for me, And I did it. And it was only much later that anybody ever actually noticed it. So I think you should never consider the world's notice as a validation of your poetry, or the world's failure to notice as an invalidation of your poetry. You write it, you and God read it, try and make it as good as you can get it.
I grew up in a family that was very athletic. I played a bunch of sports. The expectation was to go to a very big name college. And yet my desire was to make a good poem. And I had the good sense to know that would require a day job. But I had no idea what that would be when I was 19 years old. So to the kid, he, she, they, that feels like they want to be creative in their life. I'm with Malcolm here. Show up. Do it in the closet if that's necessary. If I felt like I could not tell anyone that I was making poems. And then one day a teacher, I wrote a poem, and I that weekend, it was one of my first poems ever, and I did not do the essay. I worked on the poem. And so I folded the poem up and I slipped it into the pile on his desk with all of the other essays, fully expecting that in 3 or 4 days I would get the poem back with something in the corner that said, "This is not an essay, you owe me 2 on Monday." I opened it up on that Thursday, and in the corner he had written, "Anytime you want to write a poem instead of an essay, please do."
Oh, what a great teacher.
I know. So the encouragement, the affirmation may not come from family, but if you show up and you are discreet about whoever it is you show it to, you might get I don't know that I was terribly discreet with that teacher. That was desperation. But that's what I would say. As for process, I am a morning person. So I am up a good hour and a half, 2 hours before my wife, at the end of which I always deliver her coffee in bed. And then I continue working through the morning until, I don't know, 10 or so. And then other things have to happen. But that schedule's only since I've retired.
I mean, you should check out a great poem by Wendell Berry in his Sabbath things called How to Be a Poet, brackets, to remind myself. I have it pinned up in my little poetry hut. And to be honest, I sometimes don't manage to get as far as line 3 in terms of actually doing what he says. So the opening lines of this poem are, make a place to sit down. Sit down. Be quiet. You must depend upon time, patience, skill, more of these than you have. For time, patience joins time to eternity. And then he says, accept what comes from the silence. Make the best you can of it. That's a brilliant line. Make whatever it is, serve the poem, make the best you can of it. And then he just says, which is, I'm not sure, he says, try to make a poem that doesn't obscure the silence from which it comes. And then he says this, I don't know if it's about poetry, about life, he says, there are no unsacred places, only sacred places and desecrated places. You know? But that, make a place to sit down, accept it, make the best you can of it. I think it's the best you can do. Okay, thanks. Right, next person.
This is a question for both of you. How do you end a poem? With a period.
Yeah. I'm reminded of one of the best pieces of advice about preaching I was ever given. It was in the retreat before our ordination. It was back in the day when we were all men. And this elderly retired minister gave us all these tips on preaching. And then he said, and finally, gentlemen, he said, remember, if you can't finish, you can always stop. So one of the reasons, I mean, let me confess this now. You may have noticed, those of you who've been in my class will have noticed that I'm not short of a word or two. My mother used to say things to me. She used to say, you've got the gift of the gab very galloping. But she also used to say, your tongue will get you hung. But because flow is not a problem for me, I must have constraint. I need form. The important thing about the sonnet is that it's only 14 lines. And I have to concentrate what I have to say. The first time I actually ventured some of these sonnets as the meditative homily at the 8 o'clock communion, because they were sonnets reflecting on the texts of the... This was about 3 years into my ministry in this church in Cambridge, and one of the church wardens came up to me afterwards, and they'd really enjoyed it. He said, Malcolm, why didn't you tell us from the outset that you could do this in 14 lines? You know, it's like... So I require the constraint, so I know when it's going to stop. But I'll tell you an interesting experience. I once, as I said, I get a line, and then I listen to the line, and I hear the line singing, I hear the music, and then I kind of hope the line will bring its friends along. So I'm used to starting with a line and seeing that line generate more lines. And I once had what I thought was a pretty good line, so I thought, I'm going to work with this, and I wrote it out at the top of my thing, and I waited, and then I asked it, and then I tried some more lines that seemed to flow from it, and they were all terrible. And it just was going nowhere, and I was wasting my time. I thought, what is this? And then it suddenly dawned on me that the line I'd been given was not the first line of the sonnet. It was the last line of the sonnet. I knew it was a good line, but I didn't know why. And my job was to write towards it and find out in the course of writing towards it why it was such a good line. And that was the poem. So yeah, I need clear instructions about when to end. That's why I use formal poetry.
It just so happens that the poems that I read tonight were all 14 lines, all decasyllabic as a sonnet is, but obviously they weren't rhymed. And so when I choose a received form, even if I modify the received form, I know I'm going to end on the 14th line. That's how does a poem end? You get to the 14th line. And then you work on it to make it as good a 14-line poem as possible. When I'm working in open form, what I look for as an ending is some very particular image. I want to draw the reader into the poem with imagery. Do the whatever gymnastics I'm going to do in the body of the poem, and then by the end, I want to have an image that's equal to the imagery at the beginning, and sometimes imagery that repeats. So you kind of have this recapitulation of the imagery I began with. Often, I don't know about you, Malcolm, but I know often I and other poets write in their early drafts beyond the end of the poem, as I was told by my mentors in my MFA. You've written beyond the end of the poem. So figure out where the energy starts to die and cut everything beyond that point. And sort of trust that feeling. It can also happen at the beginning of the poem. What the same helpful advisor said of other poems of mine is you've got about 7 lines of throat clearing here. Just chop it out, get rid of it, and begin where the energy begins, because there's no energy in those 7 lines. That's just meh, 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 meh. And then boom, you hit it. Boy, if you can have a reader he didn't tell me where it happened. He sort of made me figure it out. But and then there's always you're done with a poem when you're so sick of it that you don't want to look at it again, and you put it away, and you're done.
Yeah, I think it was possibly Ovid in his Ars Poetica, or it might have been Horace, I can't remember which, who's recommended that when you've written a poem and you think it's pretty good, put it in a drawer and leave it there for 9 years, he says. Then take it out again if you still think it's good, show it to your friends, And it's a little bit extreme, but yeah, you have to return to it. You have to kind of know. The thing about form and about where the energy is, that's very true. I once heard Geoffrey Hill lecturing on Blake when I was an undergraduate, and he quoted this line from a letter of Blake's about when Blake was learning to be an engraver. And Blake says the most important line in the engraving is the bounding line, because that everything will be concentrated within that. And Geoffrey Hill pointed out that Blake, in using bounding line, was carefully choosing one of those English words which means 2 opposite things at the same time, because bounding here is in one sense giving a boundary, bounding or binding in, but bounding also means bounding about, abounding with energy. And Hill's point was that it's precisely the compression and the form that concentrates the energy. And he illustrated it by saying if a modern free-form, freewheeling verse poet wrote about a tiger, they'd think that when the tiger is leaping along massively in the forest, the line must leap along for ages, and if the tiger's super strong, in lots of it, and then actually it would dissipate the energy of the tiger. When Blake wants to write a poem about a tiger, he uses an incredibly tight form, and the walls of the form are like the walls of a furnace. So tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? It's the frame and the symmetry that make the tiger so concentrated and fearful, and that's a kind of paradox. Anyway, I think we probably, we've outrun our time considerably, but there you go. Can I thank Brad and thank all of you? Yes.